Hello, it's David Leroy here, and today's slide session is on analysis of variance, otherwise known as ANOVA. So I just want to make some introductory comments first. ANOVA is part of a family of statistical analyses called the general linear model. And ANOVA can be used very flexibly, and it can be used to answer lots and lots of different research questions, and it can do that in different ways. It can be used very simply, like a t-test that you've seen in other slide presentations, and it can also be used in much more complicated experimental designs. So it's used to test whether a dependent variable, that is what you're measuring, it's used to test how that dependent variable varies in different conditions under different independent variables that are tested in the same experiment. And so the question ANOVA is able to answer is, does the value of a dependent variable depend on one or more independent variables? So ANOVA is very useful when studying phenomena that are influenced by several distinct factors simultaneously. So we're able to introduce several ideas into the same research design to see what the combination of those factors produces in terms of the influence it has on a variable that we're measuring, called the dependent variable. So it's important for you to understand the relationship between the design of an experiment and the type of ANOVA that can be used to ultimately analyze it. So you should try and have the analysis that you're planning to do clear in your head when you're designing a particular research project or experiment. On the next slide, I'm going to show you some terms that you're going to need to become familiar with. You're not going to be able to become familiar with them instantly. It's going to take a little bit of interaction. You may need to go over the slide presentation again or look at some other presentations. It's important that you gain an intuitive understanding of the terms, if you like, the lingo that is used in statistics. And you would want that to become second nature. You would want to be able to fully understand it and then be able to use those terms communicating your ideas to other people, as well as communicating your ideas in written reports. Here are some of the terms that you'll need to become familiar with. Population, what a sample from the population is, individual scores from each participant. You need to understand what a dependent variable is, what an independent variable is, what different levels of variables are. You need to be comfortable understanding factorial designs, being able to recognize cells within designs. You'll need to be able to understand the difference between subject, within subject designs and mixed designs. You will also need to have some appreciation of the different statistics that ANOVA relies on. It produces an F statistic, and it bases that on sums of squares, which are variance measures, and degrees of freedom. When I was starting out, I used to look at several different textbooks, which really helped me out. What I've discovered is no one book is going to have all of the answers that I need, and nor will one book be able to explain all of the concepts that I need to know. So please feel free to read widely. Also, a resource that will be useful to you is YouTube. And if you start plugging in some of these terms into YouTube, there's a really good likelihood that you're going to get some useful commentary and videos that people have put up. They may explain things slightly differently, but if you hear other commentators using similar terms, then it's probably going to ultimately help you out. It's good to have these concepts explained by different people in different ways in order for you to gain your own understanding. So let's look at some examples of what ANOVA is and how it is different and extends some of the information we've covered in previous slides. So take an example of a research project that researchers are proposing to do. Researchers decide to study aspects of children's memory, and they want to see whether there's a gender difference in memory between girls and boys, and they also want to know whether sugar has a detrimental effect on children's memory recall. So in the study, half of the children get candy before their memory test and half of them don't get any candy. Now try and visualize to yourself what the design of this study is. Pause the video for a moment and try and build a picture in your head about what's going on. Okay, if you've unpaused the video now and given it some thought, what you would want to be able to recognize is that you have a dependent variable, which is going to be the measure of children's memory, and you have two independent variables. You've got gender, girls and boys, and the second variable is candy, whether children receive sugar or no sugar before their memory recall test. So in terms of an ANOVA, we've got two between subjects factors. Each factor has two levels, so gender is a factor and it has two levels, girls and boys. The second factor is candy and it has two levels, and they are candy or no candy. And there is the possibility of us also obtaining an interaction. So the general linear model, ANOVA, for a design like this would be gender, sugar, and a gender by sugar interaction. So there are going to be three outcomes, three F statistics from a design like this that we're going to be interested in, because they'll inform us about the relationship between these variables and the effect that they have on memory recall in children. So I find it helpful to draw a sketch of the experimental design just to make sure that I understand it. So here we have 40 children that are going to participate in the study. We've got our independent variable here, gender, girls and boys. We've got our second independent variable, sugar or candy, yes or no before the memory test. And then we've got dependent variables that we're going to measure that are going to give us a measure of memory recall, and those are the values that are going to be analyzed. And we want to see if the variables of gender and sugar start having an influence on our measures of memory recall. And so I said before, we've got a main effect of gender, and our ANOVA will tell us whether there is an overall difference between girls and boys, looking at these means here that are outside the box. We will also have a main effect of sugar to look at, and that will tell us whether there is a significant difference between children's memory recall when they have had some sugar versus when they've not had any. And then we've got the relationship between these two factors as well. And this is the interaction between those variables. These means will tell us about the nature of our interaction. So just a quick note about interactions. These can often be quite difficult for students to understand when they're first encountered, but with practice I find most people can pick up what's going on quite quickly, but you may need to have a few goes to satisfy yourself that you're able to see what's going on. So what's the definition of an interaction? An interaction is the effect on one independent variable depending on the effect of another independent variable. So the effect of one independent variable depends on the effect of another independent variable. Let's take a look at some examples before we move on. So here's a plot of an interaction. There are a couple of variables. So we've got variable A, which has two levels, 1 and 2. And then we've got variable B, which has two levels, 1 and 2. So it's a 2 by 2 type design. If we were to put these means into an analysis, we would obtain a main effective variable A, a main effective variable B, and an interaction. And so the question I'm asking you is, what is the nature of this interaction? Well, interactions tell us a story, and I like to work them out by talking them through to myself. So what we have here is we've got the first variable A that has two levels. Now what happens to the scores across these two levels? Well, what we can see here is irrespective of which B group the participants were in, whether they were in level 1 or level 2, the effect of moving from A1 to A2 is the same. So here we see an increase in the measurement of the dependent variable, but the relationship between B1 and B2 stays the same. So we would say that there is no interaction, right? The effect of A on the dependent variable doesn't affect B. Let's take a look at another example. Just hypothetical factors again. Variable A and variable B. So what we see here is our imagined dependent variable producing higher values for A1 when the second variable is B1. And when we move to A2, we see exactly the same relationship. So here, whether or not you're in condition A1 or A2 isn't really changing your score very much, but there is quite a difference between the B variables, level 1 and level 2. Overall, B1 is scoring much higher on our graph than B2. So we would say that we most probably have no main effect of A. A is not changing. We have a main effect of B because B did change. Higher scores were produced at level B1 compared with level B2. But do we have an interaction? And the answer is no, we don't have an interaction, because the effect of one variable is not different depending on the level of another variable. So the effect of A doesn't differ depending on B. Let's take a look at another example. Again, it's just our hypothetical variable A and B plotted as parameters on the graph. Is there a main effect of A? Probably. So if we imagine the overall mean of A being somewhere around the middle here, and the overall mean of A2 being somewhere about here, maybe it looks like there is an increase. But does that depend on B? Well, B is doing the same irrespective of what level of A you're at. So at A1, yes, B1 is better than B2, but the same is true at A2. B1 is better than B2. So the effect of variable B stays the same irrespective of which level of A you're looking at. So here we would have probably a main effective A, no main effective B, and no interaction in this case either. So what about this example? Well, this is a little bit more interesting. So here, when we test A1 and compare that to A2, we see quite an increase, but only at level B1 of the second variable. At level B2, there is no change in A. So this tells us that something different is happening to our scores depending on the combination of variables that we're looking at. B1 is better than B2 at A2, but the reverse is true at A1. Is this an interaction? Yes, this is called a crossover interaction. And an interesting rule to know is that when these parameters, the lines on the graphs, are parallel to each other, there is no interaction. But when they're not parallel, there probably is an interaction. Here's another example. We've got A1 getting identical scores for B, but at level A2, the B scores separate and B2 is now higher than B1. So do we have a main effect of A? Maybe not. So the average of A1 looks like it would be about here, but then the average of these two numbers would probably be about the same. So the main effect of moving from A1 to A2 is probably not going to be significant. Do we have a main effect of B? Well, the average of B1 looks like it could be around here, and the average of B2 looks like it could be around here. So we may indeed have a main effect of variable B. And do we have an interaction? Well, now you know the rule. We can instantly see that these lines aren't parallel and that something different is going on depending on which level of A you're measuring data at. So let's go back to see our example with the sugar and candy and gender study on children's memory. Here are some hypothetical numbers that we've put into the equation. So we have a gender by sugar type analysis, and that's going to give us a main effect of gender, a main effect of sugar, and some information about the interaction between those factors. We've got marginal means out here, and just from eyeballing this data, what we can see is that people who have sugar seem to be scoring a little bit more than people that didn't have sugar before their memory test. And when we look at gender, these numbers are quite similar. So we might not really be expecting to find a gender difference in recall performance, but we might be expecting now to see a difference whether or not children have had candy or no candy before their memory test. So we can put this data, or the hypothetical data, into SPSS, go to the menus, and ask SPSS to perform an analysis of variance. The type of analysis you'll be asking it to do would be a 2x2 analysis of variance, which is going to give us statistics for gender, sugar, and the interaction between gender and sugar. And what we can see here is that for gender, we're getting a very low F statistic and a very high probability associated with that. So 0.921 is clearly not less than 0.05 and F is less than 1. So the variable gender is definitely not significant. And in fact, another rule of thumb to know is that if you get a F of less than 1, it is never going to be significant. Sugar, we're getting an F of 8, 0.007 with a p-value of 0.008. And so this is less than 0.05, so this difference here is significant, just like we assumed from looking at the means on the previous slide. It did look like the effect of candy and sugar was going to be significant. And then here, the gender by sugar interaction. Does the effect of sugar differ depending on different combinations of gender and sugar? And the answer to that is no. We've got an F of very close to 1 with an associated p-value of 0.309. That is not less than 0.05, so that statistic, F statistic, is telling us there is no significant interaction. So the ANOVA table produces quite a lot of results. Which ones do we need to extract if we were to start communicating our findings? Well, you don't need to report all of the statistics in those tables. SPSS is very good at very quickly computing lots and lots of statistics. But the ones that you need to focus on for the purpose of understanding the significant differences that you may or may not have in your study are here. And you can check back with the table and see exactly where these numbers come from. But when we're reporting F statistics, we want to report them for each of the factors and the interaction. So gender, it's got 2 levels, girl versus boy, it was not significant. And we would write that by saying F with 1 in 36 degrees of freedom equals 0.01 with a p-value of 0.92. Sugar, 2 levels, candy or no candy. Main effect, and then we would report it as an F with the associated degrees of freedom of 1 and 36, which equals an F of 8.01, and that is significant. And then we report in just the same way that the interaction isn't significant. So if you were asked to write a psychology report and communicate your findings that you've obtained from a particular study, and if it was a design like this, I would write it out this way. A between subjects ANOVA was performed that had gender, girls versus boys, and sugar, candy versus no candy, as factors. The analysis revealed a main effect of sugar with children in the candy and no candy conditions recalling 20.35 pieces of information and 16.1 pieces of information respectively. And then I also want to report the non-significant findings. There was no main effect of gender, nor was there an interaction between gender and sugar. And so you can see what we've done here is we've conducted an analysis, we've got one significant finding, we've got a couple of non-significant findings, and how we're packaging that up for the reader is to tell the reader about the significant finding first. And then at the end, because these are less interesting, is we just still want to communicate exactly what we found for the non-significant findings, but we're going to put those at the end of the paragraph because we don't want to draw the reader's attention to those first. We want them to see the significant finding. If you look at other psychology studies, you'll also notice that researchers report the results of analysis of variance in very similar ways. So here's an example of a study that I published when I just finished my PhD. See if you can see the analysis sort of talking for itself. Has the researcher provided enough information for you to get an understanding of what happened? So the results of this analysis showed that children reported a greater number of correct details than errors. Okay, so correct versus an error might have been one variable, and that there was a difference in the number of details reported across interviews. Okay, so maybe they had more than one interview. How many interviews? Well, it's a main effect I can tell from looking at this degree of freedom that there must have only been 2 interviews, because this degree of freedom is always going to be the number of levels minus 1. And there's a significant finding reported, and there is also a note here to say there was also a significant interaction between these factors, which is going to be interesting. And you can see here that the researchers haven't reported the actual means in the text, but they are referring the reader to table 1. So they're saying, look, there is a significant interaction, and if you go to table 1, you're going to be able to see the exact means and see for yourself the nature of that interaction. So that's an example of an analysis of variance where there are 2 factors and it's produced 3 interesting statistics. Right? 1 test of the main effect of gender, 1 test of the main effect of sugar, and a test of the interaction. Now, let's look at another experiment building on our previous example. Let's suppose that researchers conducted the study on children, their memory, and whether candy has an effect or not. They've analysed the results, and some time goes past, and the researchers think, you know what might be interesting to do, as if we go back to those children 6 months later and see if there were any long-term differences relating to the effect of sugar. So sugar may have exerted an influence on memory initially, but does that have any long-term effects? Were the children who had sugar just better able to recall something they heard a few moments ago, or did that cause some long-lasting permanent changes in memory that made that information always more memorable? So they want to then propose to add an extra factor, and this is going to be the follow-up. So what is the effect of adding in 1 extra factor? Well, that's going to make the design considerably more complicated. So we would be moving from a 2x2 design, gender, candy, to a 2x2x2 design, gender, candy, and delay. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. What have we got here? Well, we've got 2 between subjects factors, right, which is gender and candy, and we've got 1 within subjects factor, and that is going to be recall delay, right, either an immediate recall or waiting for 6 months. Each of these factors has 2 levels, and then we need to think through the interactions that we're going to be able to produce. So in the previous example, we had a main effect of gender, a main effect of sugar, and an interaction between gender and sugar. By adding in this extra variable delay, we've got more interactions that we need to consider. So we're going to have a main effect of gender, a main effect of sugar, a main effect of delay, an interaction between gender and sugar, an interaction between gender and delay, an interaction between sugar and delay, and a gender by sugar by delay 3-way interaction. So it's worth noticing here that we've got 3 2-way interactions. They're called 2-way interactions because there's 2 variables involved. And this is a 3-way interaction because we're trying to make sense of the interplay between 3 independent variables. So let's draw a diagram or a sketch just to see if we have everything in place. If I was to sketch it out, I'd produce something like this. We've got delay, immediate, and 6 months, broken down again by gender. So at the immediate delay, we've got girls and boys. At the 6-month delay, we've got the same girls and the same boys that were followed up. And we've got the effect of sugar versus no sugar at both of these delays. Now, in each of these cells, we still have an n equals 10. And this is a mixed design because the variables of gender and sugar between subjects in these cells, a participant can only be in one place. But they were all followed up. So the 10 participants here that were girls who had sugar are the same participants here 6 months later, the girls who had sugar. If we put some means in there, perhaps we go and collect the data, we could end up with patterns of data here, and we're going to be interested in the interaction between gender and sugar. We're going to be interested in the interaction between delay and those variables, and the interaction of all of the variables together. So if we were to run an analysis, we would end up with an F table that gives us statistics for all of the main effects and interactions. And how SPSS does this is it first of all will produce a table with just the between subjects effects in it. And so here we've got sugar, an F of 1.4, and a p-value that is not greater than 0.05, so it's not significant. So overall, now including delay, the effect of sugar has disappeared. What about the effect of gender? An F of 0, a p of 1, clearly no differences here. And a sugar by gender interaction. Well, here we have an F of 4.909 and a p-value of 0.033. That is less than 0.05, so we have a significant interaction between sugar and gender. So, reporting the effects that we've just looked at, sugar, not significant, F 1,36 equals 1.44 with a p of 0.23. Let's go back to the ANOVA table. We're saying we have an F with 1 and 36 degrees of freedom that is equal to 1.44 with a p-value of 0.23. And it's the same for gender. It's not significant. You can see the means are identical. And the interaction, so we don't have a significant effect of sugar and we don't have a significant effect of gender. But how can we have an interaction between those two? Well, this is an example of where interaction effects can be very illuminating and expose stories and narratives that we can tell about our data that are much more nuanced than simply looking at main effects. So let's just go through this carefully. We have no main effect of gender. Look, these means are all over the place. Why is there no main effect of gender? Well, what's the average score for females? The average score for females is going to be somewhere around here when we factor out sugar. And the average score for males is going to be about here too. It's just going to be the average between this number and this number. And they fall on the same line here. So that's why there is no main effect of gender. What about the main effect of candy? Well, if we took this average and this average and calculated an overall average, it would lie around here. And if we did the same, it would lie around here. Now, the analysis is telling us that there is no significant difference in candy once we've factored in delay. And that looks a little bit unusual, but if we have a look at the range, 16 to 14, There's still only a few points in it, so it might be that that difference just isn't big enough to be able to produce a statistically significant difference. But the interaction is significant. There's a different story to tell. In fact, the story we're able to tell here is that the effect of candy is completely different depending on whether you're a boy or a girl. So, candy does not improve recall of females, but it does improve the recall of males. In the absence of candy, no candy has a different effect depending on whether you're a female or a male, a boy or a girl. So boys that don't have any candy are doing the worst in this memory test. And that's a different story to be able to tell than simply reporting the main effects. Now, those were the between subjects effects. The analysis is also going to produce the rest of our effects that include the within subject factor. So these effects are all going to have delay in them. So do we have a main effect of delay? Yes, we do. An F of 6.3, which is significant. Do we have an interaction between sugar and delay? Yes, we do. Do we have an interaction between delay and gender? No. And do we have a three-way interaction? An interaction between delay, sugar, and gender. We've got an F of 2.761 and a significant level of 0.1. That is greater than 0.05, so it's not significant. And to be honest, getting significant three-way interactions and above can start leading you down a pathway to some quite complicated post hoc analyses. But we will explain that in another tutorial. So for now, you just want to understand the types of statistics that this analysis is going to be able to provide. Okay, so just reporting those effects again. The main effect of delay, which is within subject, we've got an F of with 1 and 36 degrees of freedom, and that F statistics was 63.24 with a probability value of less than 0.05, so it's significant. Now, this doesn't in itself tell us much about the direction of the significant effect. To do that, we need to look directly at the means. So we know there's a significant difference between the means. What is that difference? Well, here, immediate, overall the children are recalling 18 bits of information, and after 6 months they're only able to tell us 11 pieces of information. So over the recall delay, the amount of information provided decreased. What about the delay by sugar interaction? So this is a within subject interaction, but the sugar variable is, of course, between subject. If we look in our F table, we'll have the result of F with 1 and 36 degrees of freedom equals 9.89 with a p-value of less than 0.05. And then we need to be able to start plotting the interaction. Here are the means. These are the means that are plotted here. And I'd invite you to pause the video for a second and see if you can start to tell yourself the story of what's going on in this graph. Okay, so if you unpaused it, we want to focus here on delay. So we can see that generally recall initially is highest, but then after time it seems to drop. So there's our main effect of delay. But why there is an interaction is because the effective sugar is different at each of the delays. Here, initially, candy improved memory, but when we go back 6 months later, the children who initially got the candy boost aren't doing any better than children who didn't have candy. So you've got a different story. You can say, yeah, well, while candy has initial effects, the long-term effects are detrimental because people who had candy in the long run had the worst memory. Gender and delay. Here it's an interaction between this between subjects factor and this within subject factor delay. From the F table we get this information. We're able to produce the means, and those means can be plotted in this graph. So when we look at the relationship between delay and gender, what can you see? Pause the video again and build the narrative in your mind about what it is that we're looking at. Okay, so we have a story here that we could say, irrespective of gender, children initially recall more information at a short delay compared to a longer 6-month delay. So exactly the same thing is happening to the boys and girls across the 6-month delay, and that same thing is that recall is reliably decreasing, and there does not appear to be a difference between the recall of boys and girls overall. And we have a three-way interaction. These are mind-melting if they are significant. This is not significant, but I've plotted it anyway so you can see. Imagine if it was significant, you would have to be telling quite a complicated story here about the different effects that you would be seeing for males and females, boys and girls, versus whether they've had candy or no candy at both short and long delays. And there's quite a crossover interaction here. You can see that the opposite is happening for the blue line. So at a long delay, it looks like recall for females improves considerably with no candy, but at a short delay, the opposite is true. So you need to really stare at findings like these for a long time to see if you can come up with a description or an explanation of what it is that you're seeing, and that you would want to use the analysis to help you explain what is important. So if you think about this second study where we had 3 factors, it's given us 7 statistics. Well, whether or not they're significant is going to influence the story that you're able to tell. And it might be that you want to focus on the things that are significant and build your narrative around that. It's also important to report and consider the non-significant findings as well. So to conclude, when designing a research study or an experiment, give a lot of consideration to the analysis plan that you're ultimately going to have to follow. What might be involved? Now, it is really easy to sit down with friends and colleagues and talk about experimental designs and studies that you might want to do, and all of the different factors that you might want to include in those studies, all of which might be interesting. But we have seen that adding factors can make experimental designs much more complicated, and it's not incrementally complicated, it is exponentially complicated. So adding in just an extra 1 or 2 factors is going to give you many, many, many more findings that you're going to need to be able to explain. So you should not let the analysis drive your research questions. So you don't want to just simply do a study because it fits a nice, easy 2 by 2 experimental design. But whatever it is that you try or decide to choose to research or experiment on, you should be aware or try and make yourself aware right from the start what exactly is going to be involved. And you'll certainly want to be conducting research that is analyzable and research that you've got a good chance of being able to communicate your results coherently.